A woman lives under constant humiliation from her husband until the unexpected reading of her mother-in-law's will. Each line exposes her own son's cruelty and gives the daughter-in-law the proof she needed to break free. Before I start telling this real story, I'm asking you to write in the comments what city you're listening from. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel. That way, you help me keep growing and bring in increasingly impactful stories. Moving on with the story, and so you can understand better, I'm going to tell you how it all began. Emily Carter woke up every day at 6 in the morning, made coffee, tidied up the house, and got ready for another day of work at the local library in Briarwood, Indiana. To anyone looking from the outside, she had a normal life, even enviable. Married for over 10 years to Robert Hayes, a respected bank manager in town, living in a beautiful house with a well-kept garden. But you know, those stories that only look perfect on the surface? Well, this was one of them. Because inside that house, far from the curious eyes of the neighbors, Emily lived a reality that she herself had difficulty naming. There weren't constant screams, there wasn't physical violence, but there was something worse, a silent poison that corroded her soul day after day. And the worst part, she'd learned to swallow that poison without complaining, as if it were part of the routine. Robert had always been a controlled man, meticulous, one of those who chooses his words carefully. In public, he was polite, even attentive. People in town admired him, said Emily was lucky to have such a centered, responsible husband. But when the front door closed, the man everyone knew disappeared. In his place emerged someone Emily barely recognized as the man she'd married. It started with subtle comments about the clothes she'd chosen, about how she'd left the dishes to dry in a way he didn't like, about how she'd expressed herself poorly in front of his friends. They were small things at first, so small that Emily even thought she was being too sensitive, exactly as Robert said. But these small things kept growing, accumulating, until Emily realized she couldn't do anything right in his eyes anymore. The veiled criticisms became part of everyday life, like breakfast or the evening news. Robert had a special talent for making cruel jokes disguised as banter, the kind that got laughs from others but left Emily with a lump in her throat. Oh, Emily doesn't understand much about these things, right, honey? Or, leave it to me. My wife doesn't have much of a knack for numbers. Phrases that seemed harmless but carried a silent contempt that only she could fully feel. And when Emily tried to defend herself, even timidly, Robert would sigh as if dealing with a stubborn child. "You're overreacting again," he'd say, with that tired tone that made Emily feel guilty for having feelings. Little by little, she learned it was easier to stay quiet than face the feeling of always being wrong. Emmeline worked part-time at the municipal library, a place she loved. Among the books and the smell of paper, she found a temporary refuge, a few minutes of peace before going back home. But even this small pleasure Robert managed to contaminate. He controlled the money she earned, decided how it should be spent, questioned why she needed so much for so little work. Emily had to ask permission to buy anything, even basic items like new shampoo or a book she wanted to read. The humiliation of having to justify every penny corroded her dignity, little by little, like water wearing down stone. And when she tried to save from her own salary to have money of her own, Robert would find out and make it seem like she was being dishonest, hiding things from him, as if having autonomy was a betrayal. To avoid conflicts, Emily started making herself smaller. She stopped giving opinions, stopped making plans alone, stopped talking about her dreams. At gatherings with friends, she smiled and agreed with everything Robert said, even when she disagreed internally. In conversations with his family, she stayed quiet, serving coffee and listening. Inside the house, she measured every word, every gesture, trying to predict what might displease her husband. It was like walking on eggshells all the time, afraid of taking a wrong step and awakening the sharp criticism Robert always had on the tip of his tongue. Silence became her form of survival, her fragile armor against an enemy who lived inside her own home. But every armor has a price, and the price Emily paid was her own identity. Robert always said she was too sensitive, dramatic, that she invented problems where none existed. And after hearing this so many times, Emily started to believe it. Maybe she really was the problem. Maybe she didn't know how to communicate properly. Maybe she was incapable of being the wife Robert deserved. This constant doubt settled inside her like a shadow accompanying every thought, every decision. She began to question even her own emotion, wondering if she had the right to feel hurt or if she was just being too weak. It was a cruel mental confusion, a maze with no exit where Robert was the only guide, and he always pointed the way back to guilt and submission. Emily was losing herself piece by piece, and the worst part is, she didn't even notice anymore. Friends disappeared, little by little. Robert always had an excuse not to let her go out alone, always a criticism about the people she associated with. That friend of yours is too shallow. These people are no good, Emily. Can't you see? At first, she tried to argue, defend her friendships, but Robert had a frightening ability to turn the tables and make it seem like she was choosing strangers over her own husband. Eventually, it became easier to pull away, to accept isolation as part of married life. Phone calls became rare, invitations stopped coming, and Emily found herself increasingly alone, with Robert as her only reference to the world. And Robert liked that. She knew. He liked having her all to himself, dependent, with nowhere to run or anyone to confide in. Emily's self-confidence crumbled like a condemned building. She, who used to be a decisive woman, who had her own tastes and opinions, now found herself insecure even about the simplest decision. What clothes to wear? Better ask Robert. What movie to watch? Let him choose. Where to have lunch on Sunday? He decides better. This emotional dependence settled in so subtly that Emily didn't even notice when she completely lost the ability to trust herself. And when she looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger with a faded look, a woman she didn't recognize anymore. How had she gotten there? How had she allowed her voice to disappear like that? But these questions hurt too much to be faced, so Emily just looked away and moved forward like a robot fulfilling its programming. To anyone looking from the outside, the Hayes marriage seemed absolutely normal. They went to church on Sundays, participated in community events, exchanged pleasantries in public. No one suspected the private hell Emily lived. Robert was too smart to leave visible traces. His aggressions were psychological, emotional, the kind that doesn't leave marks on the body but destroys the soul. And Emily was ashamed to admit what she was going through. Because how do you explain that your husband never raised a hand to you but still hurt you every day? How do you make someone understand that words can be as destructive as punches, that control can be as violent as a shove? She knew no one would believe her, that they'd say she was exaggerating, that it was just a couple's fight. So Emily kept everything to herself, carrying the weight alone. Inside the house, Emily felt completely invisible. No matter what she did, it was never enough. If she prepared Robert's favorite dinner, he complained about the seasoning. If she left the house spotless, he found a dusty corner. If she tried to start a conversation about her day, he'd cut her off to talk about his problems at the bank. Emily had become a decorative figure in her own life, someone who was there to serve, to obey, not to bother. And the loneliness she felt was overwhelming, because being next to someone who treats you like you don't exist is worse than being physically alone. It's a loneliness that hurts the soul, that screams silently inside your chest, that makes you question if you really matter to anyone in this world. But amid all this darkness, there was one person who seemed to see beyond the facade. Margaret Hayes, Robert's mother, had a different look when she looked at Emily. A look that seemed to understand, that seemed to say, I know. Emily had never had the courage to open her heart to her mother-in-law, afraid that it would get back to Robert and make everything even worse. But in the few times they met, when Margaret held her hand or offered a kind smile, Emily felt a strange comfort, as if someone finally saw her pain without her needing to scream. It was a small comfort, almost imperceptible, but it was something. And without knowing it, Emily clung to that understanding, looked like someone clinging to a life preserver in the open sea. What Emily had no idea, while living those gray and empty days, was that this forced silence, this painful submission, was about to be broken in a way she could never imagine. Sometimes life holds twists we don't see coming, the kind that change everything in the blink of an eye. And for Emily Carter, this turning point was closer than she could imagine, hidden in places she'd never think to look. Because there are things in this life we only discover when it's too late, or when it's exactly the right time. And in Emily's case, the right moment was coming, bringing with it truths she needed to hear, even without knowing yet that she needed them. Margaret Hayes lived alone in an old house on the outskirts of Briarwood, one of those constructions full of history that seemed to hold secrets in every room. The house was about 20 minutes from downtown, surrounded by tall trees and a garden she cared for herself with dedication, even though she was past 70. She was a woman with firm posture, gray hair always tied in an impeccable bun, and a gaze that seemed to go through people and see things they tried to hide. Unlike her son, Margaret had a natural kindness, the kind you feel right at the first handshake. When Emily met her mother-in-law years ago, she felt an inexplicable relief, as if she'd found an oasis in the desert. Margaret always treated her with genuine respect, with that delicacy that doesn't need fancy words to be noticed. And that, for Emily, was worth more than any expensive gift or empty compliment. Visits to Margaret's house were rare, but always left a strong impression on Emily. Robert didn't like taking his wife to visit his mother much, always invented excuses about being busy or too tired. But when they went, usually on important dates like birthdays or holidays, Emily noticed something peculiar, Margaret observed. Not in an invasive or judgmental way, but with careful attention, like someone reading between the lines of a conversation. While Robert talked about work, about his achievements at the bank, about how things were going well, Margaret looked at Emily. And in that look, there were silent questions, a veiled concern that Emily pretended not to notice. It was as if her mother-in-law knew something was wrong but was waiting for the right moment to talk about it, or maybe waiting for Emily to take the first step. Robert always had a strange relationship with his mother. He talked about her with a mixture of obligatory respect and poorly disguised irritation. He said Margaret was dramatic, that she exaggerated everything, that she saw problems where none existed. "My mother's always been like this, too sensitive, too emotional," he'd comment to Emily on the way back home after visits. And something about that statement bothered Emily deeply, because she heard the same words directed at herself every day. It was as if Robert had a ready script to invalidate any woman who dared to have feelings or her own perception. And Margaret, despite her age and experience, didn't escape this cruel judgment from her own son. But unlike Emily, Margaret never seemed to bow to these criticisms. She maintained her posture, her dignity intact, as if she knew exactly who she was and didn't need anyone's approval. Emily never had the courage to open her heart to her mother-in-law about what she lived through in the marriage. The fear was too great. What if Margaret told everything to her son? What if she didn't believe her, thought Emily was making it up or exaggerating? What if this came back to Emily in an even worse way, with Robert furious that she deserted his name with his own mother? These thoughts spun in her head like an endless carousel, preventing the words from coming out. So Emily smiled, pretended everything was fine, helped Margaret in the kitchen, and exchanged pleasantries about the weather and town news. But inside, she screamed asking for help, asking someone to see her pain without her having to say anything. And somehow inexplicably, Emily felt that Margaret heard those silent screams, even though no words were spoken. There were moments, small and fleeting, when Margaret let signs slip that she knew more than she should. Once, after a Sunday lunch, Margaret held Emily's hand as they said goodbye on the porch. She squeezed with surprising strength for someone her age and said quietly, almost in a whisper, "You're stronger than you think, dear." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine, didn't quite know what that meant, but it sounded like encouragement, as if Margaret was planting a seed of courage that might one day germinate. Robert was a few yards behind, closing the car door, hearing nothing. Emily just nodded, eyes brimming with tears, and got in the car without saying anything. Those words kept echoing in her mind for weeks, like a secret mantra she repeated in the most difficult moment. On another occasion, Margaret commented on something that left Robert visibly irritated. They were having tea in the living room, talking about local news, when Margaret mentioned a real story about a woman from a neighboring town who had finally managed to separate from an abusive husband. "These things happen more than we imagine," Margaret said with a serious and direct tone. "Sometimes the monster is right in front of us." "But we don't want to see." Robert Huff rolled his eyes and abruptly changed the subject, saying it was drama from idle people. Emily froze in her chair, feeling her heart beat faster, because she knew that comment wasn't random. Margaret was talking to her through someone else's story, trying to awaken something inside her. It was coded communication, careful, but very intentional. And Emily caught the message, even though she didn't yet know what to do with it. Margaret never directly confronted her son in front of Emily. She was too smart for that, knew that an open confrontation could put her daughter-in-law in even greater danger. So she used other strategies, more subtle, more calculated. She asked about Emily's work, about how she was feeling, if she was happy, if she had personal plans. Simple questions, apparently innocent, but touching on painful points that Robert always ignored. And when Robert tried to answer for Emily, talking about their plans or about how she was fine, Margaret would interrupt him gently, but firmly. Let her answer, Robert. I asked Emily. Her son's discomfort was visible in these moments, and Emily felt a mixture of gratification and terror. Gratification because someone was finally giving her a voice. Terror for the consequences this could bring later, on the way back home. The few conversations Emily and Margaret had alone were filled with a strange chemistry, made of things unsaid but deeply felt. While drying dishes together or setting the table, there was a comfortable silence between them. Different from the tense and heavy silence Emily lived with Robert, it was as if Margaret was saying without words, I see you. I know what's happening. And when the time comes, you'll find the strength you need. Emily wanted to believe that, wanted to cling to that implicit promise, but fear was always greater. Fear of making mistakes, of making everything worse, of discovering there was no possible way out. So she just thanked her mother-in-law's affection with sad smiles, and continued living her routine of silent humiliation, waiting for a miracle that seemed never to come. Robert said his mother was getting too old, that she was starting to lose it, as he liked to say. He said this with a tone of poorly disguised contempt, as if Margaret's age were a character, an inconvenience. Emily hated when he talked like that, felt a dull anger growing inside her chest, but never had the courage to openly defend her mother. Another lost battle, another time she swallowed her words and let Robert distill his poison without consequences. But Margaret didn't seem affected by her son's comment. She maintained her routine, her habits, her dignity. It was as if she was above all that, as if she had a greater mission that no one else knew about. And this resilience impressed Emily, who wondered where so much strength came from in a woman who had already lived so much and seen so much. In the last months before what was to come, Emily noticed that Margaret seemed more distant, more introspective, still kind, still attentive, but there was something different in her look, as if she were carrying a secret weight. Emily even asked once if everything was okay, and Margaret just smiled that enigmatic way and replied, Everything has its time, dear. Everything has its time. At the time, Emily didn't understand what that meant, thought it was just one of those philosophical phrases older people like to say. But those words would gain a completely different meaning very soon. A meaning that would turn Emily's life upside down and finally bring light to the shadows she'd lived in for so long. Because Margaret wasn't just observing, she was recording, documenting, preparing something that would change everything. What Emily didn't know, while continuing to live her days of submission and forced silence, was that Margaret had a plan. A plan carefully crafted, built over years of attentive observation and silent pain from seeing her own son transform into something she never imagined he'd become. Margaret knew things Emily would only discover later. Secrets kept in locked drawers, truths written on pages no one had read yet, and these truths were waiting for the right moment to come to light, like buried seeds waiting for the right season to sprout. The time was coming, even though no one knew it yet. And when it came, nothing would ever be the same again. Robert's aggressions were never physical. And maybe that's exactly why Emily took so long to understand she was being abused. There were no punches, no shoves, no purple marks. She could show someone and say, look what he did to me. What there was something much more insidious, much harder to name and prove. It was constant psychological violence, methodical, almost scientific in how it destroyed Emily from the inside without leaving any visible trace on the outside. Robert had turned humiliation into art, knew exactly where to press to hurt more, which words to use to cut deeper, how to make Emily feel small without ever needing to raise his voice. And the worst part, he did it so naturally that he didn't even seem to notice the damage he caused, as if emotionally destroying his wife was just part of the daily routine, like brushing teeth or drinking coffee. In public, the humiliations came disguised as jokes. Robert had a special talent for ridiculing Emily in front of other people, making everyone laugh, except her. At a dinner with friends, he'd tell stories about how Emily had gotten lost on the way to a simple place, imitating her voice in an exaggerated and infantilized way, making everyone laugh at her supposed lack of sense of direction. Or he'd comment about how she'd taken 2 hours to choose a dress for the party, rolling his eyes and making dramatic gestures while everyone agreed that women really took too long to get ready. Emily smiled, forcing a laugh that didn't reach her eyes, feeling her face burn with shame but not knowing how to react. If she complained, she'd be called too sensitive, someone who can't take a joke. If she stayed quiet, the humiliation intensified, because Robert noticed he could continue without consequences. It was a perfect trap, with no apparent way out. Financial control was another powerful tool in Robert's arsenal. He was the bank manager, earned well, and made a point of making it clear that it was his money that supported the house. Emily worked part-time at the library, but her salary barely covered the most basic personal expenses, and even so Robert controlled every penny. She had to ask permission to buy anything, from new lipstick to extra groceries for the month. "What do you need that for?" he'd ask with that tone of someone dealing with an irresponsible child. "Don't you think we already have enough?" Emily found herself having to justify basic needs, having to negotiate for things that should be her right, and when she saved a few dollars from her own salary to have a personal reserve, Robert would find out and make a scene, saying she was hiding money from him, being dishonest, scheming something behind his back. The humiliation of not having financial autonomy was daily, constant, crushing. Robert also controlled who Emily could talk to and where she could go. At the beginning of the marriage, this came disguised as romantic jealousy, the kind people usually find cute. "I don't like when you spend too much time with that friend of yours. She's a bad influence," he'd say. And Emily even thought it was a sign that he cared. But over Chimmy, the net tightened. He checked her phone, asked who she'd talked to at work, disapproved of almost all the friendships she had. "That guy from the library is kinda weird, don't you think? That friend of yours is always getting into trouble. Better keep your distance." Little by little, Emily pulled away, lost connection, became increasingly dependent on Robert as her only source of social interaction. And he liked it, she noticed. He liked knowing she had nowhere to run, no one to confide in, was completely under his control. Comments about Emily's appearance were cruel and constant. Robert never missed an opportunity to point out a flaw, an imperfection, something she could improve. "Don't you think you're gaining a few pounds?" he'd say while she ate, making Emily put down her fork mid-meal, appetite instantly disappearing. "Isn't that dress too tight? Your hair looked better before. Don't you want to try different makeup? Like this, you look tired." They were loose phrases, apparently innocent, but accumulating in Emily's mind like small poison, poisoning how she saw herself. She started avoiding mirrors, feeling inadequate in any clothes she wore, believing she really was ugly, uninteresting, undesirable. Robert had managed to plant insecurity so deep inside her that Emily didn't even need his criticisms anymore. She criticized herself all the time, had internalized her husband's cruel voice as if it were her own inner voice. Emily's intelligence was also constantly questioned. Robert made a point of correcting anything she said, even when she was right. If Emily commented on news she'd read, Robert would interrupt her to explain better, as if she didn't have the capacity to understand on her own. If she gave an opinion about anything, he'd sigh and say, "It's not quite like that," deconstructing what she'd said and reconstructing it his way, always making it clear he knew more, understood better, was more capable. In conversations with other people, he'd interrupt her mid-sentence to complete for her, or simply ignore what she said and change the subject. Emily kept losing confidence in her own ability to think, to analyze, to have valid opinion. She started thinking she really was dumb, limited, incapable of contributing anything significant, and this poisoned belief paralyzed her even more, creating a vicious cycle of silence and submission. Emily's usefulness as a person was also constantly questioned. Robert had a subtle way of making her feel she only had value if she was serving him somehow. If she prepared dinner, he ate in silence, without any thanks or acknowledgement. If she left the house spotless, he found a detail that wasn't perfect and focused only on that. If she tried to do something special, like prepare a dessert he liked, or organize a surprise, he received it with indifference or even criticism. "Didn't you have anything better to do? You spent money on this? I wasn't even in the mood to eat that today." Emily learned that nothing she did would be enough, that she'd never be able to please Robert, that her existence was tolerated but not celebrated, and this feeling of uselessness corroded her self-esteem in a devastating way, making her question if she had any purpose, any value as a human being. Little by little, Emily started losing the notion of who she was. Her opinions became echoes of Robert's opinion. Her tastes molded to his taste. Her dreams were filed away in a locked mental drawer she was afraid to open. She became a shadow, a faded version of herself, existing only to serve and please someone who was never satisfied. And the scariest thing of all was that this happened so gradually that Emily barely noticed the transformation. It was as if she'd been sculpted little by little, with each criticism being a hammer blow that removed pieces of her essence until only what Robert wanted her to be remained. An obedient wife, silent, invisible, a presence that didn't bother, didn't question, simply accepted everything without resistance. That's what she'd become, and the pain of that realization was almost unbearable. The friends Emilita disappeared from her life, one by one. Some gave up calling after several refused invitations. Others pulled away because they noticed something was wrong but didn't know how to help. Emily missed these connections, but the effort of maintaining friendships while hiding the truth about the marriage was too exhausting. It was easier to isolate herself, to withdraw, to live in that suffocating bubble where only she and Robert existed. At least that way she didn't have to pretend everything was fine, didn't have to invent excuses about why she couldn't go out, didn't have to lie about happiness she didn't feel. Loneliness became her constant companion, a heavy presence that accompanied her at all times. Even when she was next to Robert, she felt deeply alone, because being with someone who diminishes you is even lonelier than being physically alone. Emily's self-esteem was on the floor, trampled, shattered. She didn't recognize herself anymore when she looked in the mirror, saw a faded woman with an empty look, forced smile. Where had that girl gone, who loved reading, who had dreams, who laughed for real? She'd been buried under layers and layers of humiliation, suffocated by the weight of Robert's impossible expectations, annihilated by constant criticism and lack of true love. Emily had become an empty shell, functioning on autopilot, waking up every day, not really knowing why she continued, what the purpose of all that was. But she continued because she didn't know how to do anything else, because she was afraid of what would happen if she tried to change, because she believed that was all she deserved. It was a prison without bars, but equally impossible to escape. To anyone looking from the outside, the Hayes couple seemed absolutely normal. No one in town suspected the private hell Emily lived in. Robert was respected, even admired. Emily was seen as a dedicated wife, maybe a little shy, but nothing that drew much attention. This apparent normalcy was Robert's perfect armor, the protection that guaranteed he could continue his reign of psychological terror without being bothered. And Emily didn't know how to break that facade, how to make someone see what she lived through without seeming crazy or exaggerated. So she continued maintaining appearances, smiling when needed, greeting the neighbors, pretending that marriage was as common and problem-free as any other. But inside, she was disintegrating, coming apart piece by piece, without anyone noticing, until someone noticed. Someone was recording everything, noting every detail, preparing a revelation Emily didn't even imagine existed. The news of Margaret's death arrived on a cold November morning, one of those when the sky seems to weigh on the entire town. Emily was preparing coffee when the phone rang, and from Robert's tone of voice when he answered, she immediately knew something serious had happened. "When?" he asked, his voice strangely controlled, almost mechanical. "I understand. Yes, I'll handle everything." When he hung up, he turned to Emily and simply said, "My mother died during the heart attack." The words came out of his mouth without any apparent emotion, as if he were reporting the result of a meeting at the bank. Emily felt her legs buckle, a wave of shock and sadness taking over her entire body. Margaret, that kind woman who always had an understanding look for her, had passed, and the way Robert communicated the news, so cold and distant, left Emily even more shaken. How could someone receive news of their own mother's death and seem so ... indifferent? In the following days, Emily expected to see Robert demonstrate some kind of grief, some fragility, some sign that his mother's loss had affected him. But what she saw was the opposite. Robert was pragmatic, almost robotically efficient. He called the funeral home, organized the wake, chose the casket, all with a coldness Emily found disturbing. There were no tears, No moments of reflective silence, no heavy sadness that normally accompanies the death of a loved one. Robert treated his mother's death as if it were just another task on the to-do list, something that needed to be resolved quickly so he could return to normal routine. Emily tried to offer comfort a few times, putting her hand on his shoulder, asking if he was okay. But Robert just pushed her away with an impatient wave of his hand. "I'm dealing with this my way," he'd say, ending any attempt at emotional connection. The wake was a strange and uncomfortable experience. The small chapel was full of people from town who knew Margaret, neighbors, church members, some old friends. Everyone talked about what a wonderful woman she was, kind, always willing to help whoever needed. Emily listened to those testimonials with tears streaming down her face, feeling genuine pain for the loss of the one person in Robert's family who had treated her with dignity. But when she looked at her husband, she saw only a mask of professional cordiality. Robert greeted people, thanked them for their condolences, but there was something empty in those gestures, as if he were just playing the role of grieving son without actually feeling any. Some people even commented among themselves, in whispers Emily managed to catch, "Robert's so strong, isn't he? Doesn't even seem like he lost his mother." But Emily knew that wasn't strength. It was absence of real emotion. It was coldness itself. A few days after the funeral, when Emily was still processing the loss, Robert started talking insistently about Margaret's will. Emily was in the kitchen, trying to find some comfort in a cup of tea, when he came in with that air of someone who had something important to discuss. "We need to go to the lawyer to resolve my mother's inheritance matter," he said, pulling out a chair and sitting with that efficient executive posture. Emily blinked, confused. "But Robert, she just died. Don't you want to wait a bit?" He rolled his eyes, as if Emily had said something absurd. "Wait for what? These things need to be resolved, Emily. Bureaucracy doesn't wait for our feeling." The way he spoke, so practical and devoid of sensitivity, made Emily's stomach turn. It seemed Robert was more interested in what he could gain from his mother's death than in mourning her loss. In the following days, Robert became almost obsessive about the will. He called the lawyer constantly, asking when they could schedule the official reading, what documents were needed, how long the process would take. Emily observed all this with a mixture of sadness and disgust. How could someone be so cold, so calculating? Margaret had barely been buried and her son was practically counting the inheritance money. "My mother didn't have much," Robert commented casually during dinner one night, "but the house is worth something, and she had some savings. It'll be resolved quickly." The way he talked, so detached, so transactional, made Emily wonder if Robert had any capacity to truly love anyone, or if all the people in his life were just pieces on a board, useful as long as they served some purpose. Emily started finding Robert's rush strange. She knew Margaret well enough to know she was an organized woman, meticulous, careful with her affairs. It didn't make sense that Robert thought everything would be resolved quickly, as he said. Women like Margaret didn't leave things to chance. They planned, documented, made sure everything was in order. There was something about Robert's anxious insistence that didn't fit, something that made a discreet alarm sound in Emily's mind. But she couldn't identify exactly what. Maybe it was just the feeling that Robert knew less about his own mother than he imagined. Or maybe it was the intuition that Margaret had kept more secrets than anyone suspected. Either way, Emily felt a chill down her spine whenever Robert mentioned the will, as if something big was about to happen. The atmosphere inside the house became even more tense in the weeks that followed. Robert was irritable, impatient, constantly checking emails and answering calls from the lawyer. Emily tried to stay invisible, doing her household chores in silence, avoiding any interaction that could trigger his anger. But even so, Robert found reasons to take his frustration out on her. "Can't you do anything right?" He complained about dinner that was perfectly well made. "Why is this house always a mess?" He grumbled about a house that was impeccable. Emily recognized the signs, knew that when Robert got like this, it was better to simply disappear, become even more invisible than she already was. But it was difficult, because his suffocating presence filled every corner of the house. There was no place to truly hide. One night, Robert was in his home office, handling papers and making notes. Emily passed by the half-open door and saw him murmuring to himself, calculating something she couldn't understand. There was an expression on his face she'd never seen before, a mixture of anxiety and expectation, as if he were waiting for something very specific and didn't know if he'd get it. Emily felt curious, but also afraid to ask anything. Robert didn't like being questioned, especially about matters he considered his. So she just kept walking, went up to the bedroom, and laid on the bed, looking at the ceiling and trying to understand what was happening. There was something wrong there, something she couldn't name but felt deep in her soul. Margaret had died, and that had changed something fundamental in the house dynamic, but Emily didn't yet know in which direction things were going. Sometimes, in the silence of night, Emily found herself thinking about Margaret. She remembered her mother-in-law's understanding look, the kind words, that firm handshake on the porch. "You're stronger than you think." That phrase echoed in her mind like a riddle she couldn't decipher. Why had Margaret said that? What did she know? What had she seen? Emily felt there was more to her mother-in-law's story than she knew, more layers to that silent and observant woman than anyone had noticed. And now that Margaret had passed, Emily felt as if she'd lost a secret ally, someone who understood her pain even without any words being exchanged. The feeling of loneliness became even deeper, more suffocating, almost unbearable. While Robert consumed himself with anxiety about the inheritance, Emily dealt with grief in a much more genuine way. She cried alone in the bathroom, hugged her pillow at night, and let tears fall silently. Margaret had been kind to her when no one else was, had offered those rare moments of humanity in a world that seemed determined to crush Emily. And now she was gone. Taking with her that comforting presence Emily didn't even know she needed so much until she lost it. Margaret's house was empty now, windows closed, the garden starting to grow out of control. Emily passed by there sometimes on her way to work, and felt a tightness in her chest. She wished she could go back in time, had had the courage to open her heart to her mother-in-law, to tell everything she lived through and ask for help. But it was too late now. Or was it? The date for the will reading was finally set. Robert announced this during breakfast with a tone of poorly disguised satisfaction. "Finally, we're going to resolve this," he said, as if talking about closing a lucrative deal. Emily just nodded, feeling a knot in her stomach she couldn't explain. There was something about that moment that seemed bigger than just reading a will, something that made every cell in her body shiver in anticipation. It was as if the universe were holding its breath, waiting for something significant that was about to happen. And Emily, even without knowing yet what it was, felt that this will reading wouldn't be anything Robert expected. Absolutely nothing. The lawyer's office was in downtown Briarwood, in one of those old red brick buildings that seemed to have gone through decades without changing. Emily walked in next to Robert, feeling her stomach churn with nervousness. She didn't really know why she was so anxious. After all, this was just the reading of Margaret's will, something that should be simple and straightforward. But there was a tension in the air she could physically feel, as if the room were charged with electricity about to discharge. Robert, unlike her, seemed confident, almost relaxed. He greeted the lawyer, a gray-haired gentleman named Mr. Thompson, with a firm handshake and a smile Emily rarely saw. It was the smile of someone who thought they were about to gain something, who was sure things would go the way he wanted. Emily sat in a worn leather chair, hands sweating, and waited. Mr. Thompson adjusted his glasses and opened a thick folder on the desk. There were several documents inside, much more than Emily expected for a simple will. The lawyer cleared his throat, looked at Robert and then at Emily, and began reading with that formal and measured voice lawyers tend to use. "I, Margaret Eleanor Hayes, in full use of my mental faculties, declare this as my last will and testament." The first lines were standard, bureaucratic, talking about revoking previous wills and appointing Mr. Thompson as executor. Robert drummed his fingers on the chair, clearly impatient to get to the part that really interested him, the distribution of assets. Emily just listened, trying to stay present, but part of her wanted to be anywhere else. There was something in that room that left her deeply uncomfortable, as if she were about to witness something that would change everything. As Mr. Thompson continued reading, Robert's face started to change. First, it was just a slight furrowing of the brow, then a clenching of the jaw, then a growing paleness that took over his cheeks. The lawyer read about Margaret's house, about the savings, about some personal object, but there was something more there, something Robert clearly wasn't expecting. Before proceeding with the distribution of assets, Mr. Thompson, looking over his glasses with a serious expression, "Margaret Hayes left detailed records that must be read as an integral part of this will." Emily felt her heart race. Records? What kind of records? Robert leaned forward in his chair, his previous confidence evaporating quickly. "What records?" he asked, his voice coming out higher than normal. Mr. Thompson just continued reading, ignoring the interruption. The lawyer began reading what Margaret had written, and each word was like a bomb exploding inside the room. Margaret had documented everything. Episodes of humiliation Robert had inflicted not only on Emily, but on other people over the years. She described, with precise dates and details, how her son had treated his wife with contempt, how he controlled her money, how he isolated her socially, how he constantly diminished her. Emily felt tears beginning to stream down her face, a mixture of shock, relief, and pain. Margaret had really seen everything. It wasn't Emily's imagination. She wasn't being too sensitive or dramatic. It was real. It was true. And now it was there, in words written by her mother-in-law herself, validating years of silent suffering. Emily could barely breathe. Such was the emotion taking over her. Robert had gone completely pale, his hands gripping the chair arms so tightly his knuckles were white. "This is absurd," he managed to say, his voice trembling with contained rage. "My mother was senile. She didn't know what she was writing." But Mr. Thompson raised a hand, interrupting. "Mr. Hayes, I can assure you that Margaret was in perfect mental state when she drafted this will. She came to this office several times over the last 2 years, always lucid, always determined. These records were made with full awareness and purpose." The lawyer's confirmation was like a punch in Robert's stomach. He was left speechless, just staring at the desk, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Emily, on the other hand, felt a strange mixture of terror and liberation. The truth was finally coming to light, but the consequences of this were terrifying. Mr. Thompson continued reading. Margaret hadn't just documented Robert's emotional abuse against Emily. She'd gone beyond. She described episodes from her son's youth, manipulative behaviors, lies, attempts to control other people. She talked about previous relationships Robert had had, girls who had broken up with him, claiming he was possessive and cruel. She mentioned co-workers who had complained about his behavior, always describing situations where Robert tried to dominate, control, diminish others. It was a devastating portrait of someone who had spent their entire life manipulating and hurting people. And Margaret had recorded it all with the precision of an investigator. Emily glanced at Robert and saw something she'd never seen before. Genuine fear. He was being exposed, and there was no way to deny or deflect from that meticulously documented truth. Then came the part about the inheritance, and the silence in the room became even heavier. Margaret, with her characteristic clarity, had named Emily as beneficiary of a significant part of the assets. The house on the outskirts of town, where Margaret had lived alone for so many years, would be Emily's. Half of Margaret's savings, a considerable amount she'd accumulated over her lifetime, would also be Emily's. Robert would receive the other half of the money in some personal objects, but nothing more. The lawyer read Margaret's exact words. "I leave these assets to Emily Carter Hayes, because I know she will need resources to rebuild her life and her independence. She deserves to have the necessary tools to free herself from a situation that I, as a mother, should have prevented long ago." Emily covered her face with her hand, sobbing openly. This was more than an inheritance. It was a request for forgiveness. It was a push toward freedom. It was Margaret saying, "I see you. I believe in you. Now, go and be free." Robert stood up abruptly from his chair, knocking it backward with a crash that made Emily and Mr. Thompson jump in fright. "This is total humiliation," he shouted, his face red with rage. "My own mother betraying me, defaming me, handing my assets over to an ungrateful wife who never did anything for her." The lawyer remained calm, accustomed to emotional reactions in situations like this. "Mr. Hayes, I suggest you calm down. The will is legal, valid, and will be executed as Margaret wished. Any challenge you want to make can be discussed later, but it won't change the facts presented here." Robert looked at the lawyer with hatred, then looked at Emily with an expression she'd never seen, a mixture of fury, betrayal, and something deeper, something like public humiliation. Emily felt fear, but also felt something new, something she hadn't felt in years. Power. The lawyer continued, relentless. Margaret had left specific instructions that the records should be read in full in the presence of both Robert and Emily. She wanted there to be no doubts, that everything be laid out in the open. and there was more. Margaret had included copies of these records that would be delivered to a therapist specializing in abusive relationships, with the recommendation that Emily seek professional support. She'd even left the name and contact of a lawyer specializing in divorce in case Emily decided to follow that path. Margaret had thought of everything, had prepared a complete exit path for her daughter-in-law, paving each step with care and love. Emily realized in that moment how deeply Margaret had loved her, how desperate she was to help but couldn't intervene directly while she was alive. Now, even after death, Margaret was finally giving Emily the tools she needed to save herself. The silence in the room was deafening. Robert breathed heavily, his chest rising and falling in quick, angry movement. Emily continued crying, but now they weren't just tears of pain. They were also tears of gratitude, relief, hope. Mr. Thompson closed the folder, looked at both and said firmly, "The will has been read as requested by Margaret Hayes. The necessary documents for the transfer of assets will be prepared in the coming weeks. Any questions or legal matters can be directed to this office." Robert grabbed his coat with abrupt movements and left the room, slamming the door so hard the pictures on the wall trembled. Emily sat there, shaking, unable to move. The lawyer approached gently and placed an envelope in her hand. "Margaret asked me to deliver this personally," he said with a sad smile. Emily looked at the envelope, saw her name written by hand by her mother-in-law, and felt a new wave of emotion. This wasn't just inheritance. It was much more than money or property. It was a public denunciation of Robert's behavior. It was Margaret's voice finally being heard. It was the truth coming to light after years buried in silence. Emily held the envelope against her chest and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The hope that maybe, just maybe, she could have a different life. A life where she wasn't humiliated every day, where she had a voice, where she was treated with dignity. Margaret had planted that seed even after death, and now Emily had to find the courage to water it and let it grow. But Robert's true face, the one he hid so well from everyone, was starting to emerge from the shadows, and when that happened completely, there would be no turning back. Emily waited until she got home to open the envelope Mr. Thompson had given her. Robert had left the lawyer's office like a hurricane and disappeared. Probably went driving aimlessly to try to process everything he'd just heard. Emily took advantage of his absence to finally breathe, to finally absorb what had happened in that room. She sat on the living room couch, hands trembling as she carefully tore open the envelope. Inside were several letters, all handwritten by Margaret herself, with that elegant and firm handwriting Emily recognized from birthday cards and occasional notes. Just seeing those letters, Emily felt the tears return. Margaret had left words for her, final thoughts, messages she didn't have the courage or opportunity to say while alive. Emily picked up the first letter, took a deep breath, and began to read. "My dear Emily," the letter began, and just those 3 words made Emily's heart tighten. "If you're reading this, it means I've passed and the truth has finally come to light. I ask forgiveness for not having had the courage to intervene while I was alive. I ask forgiveness for having watched my son destroy you little by little and not having done anything more concrete to stop it. But I want you to know that I saw everything. Every sad look, every swallowed word, every moment you made yourself smaller to fit into his cruel expectations. And I want you to know that none of this was your fault." Emily had to stop reading for a moment, emotion taking over her overwhelmingly. Those words were exactly what she needed to hear. The validation she'd been seeking for so long. Margaret had seen. Margaret had understood. Emily wasn't crazy, wasn't exaggerating, wasn't being too sensitive. It was all real. And finally, someone was confirming it. The letter continued, and Margaret described with painful clarity Robert's behavior since he was young. She told about how he'd always been manipulative, even as a child, how he learned early to use words as weapons, how he discovered he could control people through fear and guilt. Margaret wrote about Robert's father, her husband who had died when Robert was a teenager, and how that man also had manipulative and controlling traits. "I tried to raise him differently," Margaret wrote. "But some things seem to be rooted deeper than education. Or maybe I failed as a mother. I don't know. What I know is that my son became someone capable of hurting people who love him. And that breaks my heart." Emily wiped away tears and continued reading, each word resonating inside her like bells of truth finally ringing. Margaret described specific episodes Emily didn't even know her mother-in-law had witnessed. Once, During a Christmas dinner at Margaret's house, Robert had made a cruel comment about Emily's clothes, disguised as a joke, and Margaret had seen her daughter-in-law's face flush with shame. Another time, Margaret had called their house and heard Robert shouting in the background. Then Emily answered with a trembling voice, saying everything was fine. Margaret had written everything down, marked the dates, recorded the details. "I started documenting when I realized you would never ask for help," she wrote. "You were too afraid, and I understood that. So I decided I would do this for you, that I would leave a record that could one day be your salvation." Emily felt a mixture of gratitude and sadness so intense she could barely continue reading. Margaret had done all that for her, had carried that weight alone, preparing an exit Emily didn't even know existed. One of the letters was particularly difficult to read. In it, Margaret talked about her own failures and regrets. "I should have confronted Robert directly," she wrote. "Should have set boundaries, should have encouraged you to leave, should have done more, but I was afraid to. Afraid of losing him completely, afraid he'd never speak to me again, afraid my interference would make things worse for you. I know these aren't excuses. They're just explanations from an elderly mother and tired woman who didn't have the courage she should have had." Emily cried even more reading that, because she understood perfectly. She herself had spent years paralyzed by fear, unavowed to act, so how could she judge Margaret for feeling the same? Her mother-in-law had done what she could within the limitations of her own, and that was already more than anyone else had done for Emily. Margaret also wrote about Robert's previous relationships, things Emily had never known. Before Emily, there was a girl named Sarah who had dated Robert for 2 years. Margaret told how Sarah had ended the relationship, claiming Robert was possessive and controlling, that he made her feel small and incapable. "I should have paid more attention to that pattern," Margaret wrote. "Should have realized that wasn't Sarah's problem. It was my son's problem. But I was in denial, thinking it was just his immaturity, that he'd improve with time. I was wrong." There was also mention of Robert's co-workers who had complained about his behavior, always wanting to be in control, always diminishing others' contributions. Margaret had collected this information over the years, putting together a devastating puzzle of what her son really was beneath the facade of respectable man. But the most powerful part of the letters was when Margaret spoke directly about Emily, about who she saw when she looked at her daughter. "You're a strong woman, Emily, even if you don't feel that way now. You survived years of emotional abuse and still maintain your kindness, your ability to care for others, your humanity intact. That requires a strength few people possess. Robert tried to break you, but you didn't break. You bent, you adapted to survive, but your essence is still there, waiting to resurface." Emily read those words several times, letting them penetrate deep into her soul. Margaret saw strength in her, saw value, saw something Emily was sure she'd lost long ago. And hearing that from someone she respected so much was like receiving a priceless gift, an anchor of hope in a sea of despair. Margaret also gave practical advice in the letters. She talked about the importance of Emily seeking professional help, talking to a therapist who could help her process years of trauma. She mentioned support groups for women in abusive relationships, places where Emily could find other people who would understand her pain without judgment. "Don't face this alone," Margaret wrote with palpable urgency. "You've spent too much time isolated, carrying this weight alone. Now it's time to accept help, to surround yourself with people who want your well-being, to build a support network Robert never allowed you to have." Emily knew Margaret was right. Isolation had been one of Robert's most effective weapons, and now it was time to reverse that, to reconnect with the world, to remember there were good people out there who would care about her if she let them. In the last letter, Margaret made a specific request. "I want you to use the resources I'm leaving to rebuild your life. The house is yours, a safe place where Robert has no power. The money is yours, financial freedom he never allowed you to have. Use all of this not just to survive, but to thrive. Go back to school if you want, change careers, travel, do everything you dreamed of doing but never could. Live, Emily. Truly live. Don't just exist. This is my last wish, much more important than any material asset, that you find your happiness, your voice, your freedom." Emily pressed the letters against her chest, crying freely now, not caring if anyone heard. Margaret had done more for her than anyone in her life, had planned her liberation with care and love, even knowing she wouldn't be alive to see the result. Emily sat there for hours, rereading the letters, absorbing every word, every piece of advice, every expression of love and care. For the first time in years, she didn't feel completely alone. Margaret was there with her, in the words left behind, in the legacy of courage she'd planted, and something started to change inside Emily in that moment. It wasn't an instant transformation. It wasn't like she suddenly had all the courage in the world, but it was the beginning of something, a crack in the emotional prison where she'd lived for so long. Light was entering through that crack, and Emily could see it for the first time. There was a way out, paved by Margaret, even after death, and Emily was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could walk it. But Emily knew this awakening wouldn't go unnoticed. Robert wasn't the type of man who accepted losing control easily. He'd been exposed, publicly humiliated by his own mother's will, and had lost a significant part of the inheritance he thought would be entirely his. His rage would be monumental, and Emily knew she'd have to face it very soon. But now, for the first time, she wasn't completely unarmed. She had Margaret's words, she had the validation she needed. She had financial resources and a house where she could go. She had, for the first time in years, options, and that changed everything. The confrontation was coming, inevitable as a storm on the horizon, but Emily felt that this time would be different. This time, she wouldn't bow her head. Robert arrived home when the sun had already completely set, leaving the town plunged in a darkness that seemed to perfectly match the climate Emily felt in the air. She was in the kitchen, still holding Margaret's letters, when she heard the front door open forcefully. The sound of his footsteps echoing through the hallway was heavy, loaded with a rage she could feel before even seeing him. Emily quickly put the letters in the pocket of the coat hanging on the chair and tried to mentally prepare for what was about to happen. Her heart beat fast, hands sweated, but there was something different this time. A thread of determination she didn't know she possessed was starting to form inside her, fragile, still, but present. Robert entered the kitchen like a storm, his face red and contorted in an expression of fury Emily knew well, but now seemed amplified, more dangerous, more uncontrolled. "You," he shouted, pointing his finger at Emily as if she were guilty of some horrible crime. "You manipulated my mother. You poisoned her mind against." The accusation was so absurd Emily almost laughed, but managed to control herself. She hadn't done any of that, had never spoken badly of Robert to Margaret, had never asked anything from her mother. But of course, Robert needed to blame someone, and Emily had always been the easiest target. "Robert, I never said anything to your mother," Emily said, trying to keep her voice calm, even with terror growing inside her. She saw everything herself. She observed and drew her own conclusion. Robert took 2 steps forward, invading Emily's personal space in an intimidating way. "Liar," he growled. "My mother would never do this to me if someone hadn't put these ideas in her head. You're a manipulator. You always have been." Emily felt anger start to bubble inside her, an emotion she'd suppressed for so long she barely recognized it anymore. How did he have the nerve to call her a manipulator when he was the master of manipulation? How could he distort reality so completely as to make himself the victim in this situation? "I didn't manipulate anyone," Emily responded, and this time her voice came out firmer than she expected. "Your mother was an intelligent and observant woman. She saw how you treat me, Robert. She saw and documented everything." The mention of the documents made Robert's face turn even redder. He started pacing back and forth in the kitchen, hands opening and closing into fists, breathing heavy and irregular. It was like watching someone on the verge of collapse, but Emily didn't feel sorry. She felt only a cold recognition of the situation. The monster was being unmasked, and he didn't know how to deal with it. "Everything she wrote is a lie." Robert continued shouting, his voice echoing off the house walls. "I always treated you well, always gave you everything you needed. You're the one who's ungrateful, a weak woman who doesn't know how to appreciate what she has." Emily closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deep. Those were the same accusations she'd heard for years, the same attempts to invert reality and make her doubt herself. But something had changed. Margaret's words still echoed in her mind. The validation she'd received through those letters had created an invisible armor around her. When Emily opened her eyes again and looked at Robert, she no longer saw the powerful and intimidating man she'd always seen. She saw a frightened man, desperate, losing the control he'd always had over her, and that changed everything. "You know it's not a lie," Emily said, and her own voice surprised her. It was firm, clear, without the tremor that normally accompanied any confrontation with Robert. You know exactly what you did to me all these. The humiliations, the control, the cruel words, everything your mother wrote is true. And deep down you know that. Robert stopped walking and stood completely still for a moment, looking at Emily as if she'd just grown a second head. He wasn't used to this, to Emily responding, to Emily defending herself, to Emily having her own voice. During all those years, she'd been submissive, quiet, always giving in. But now there was something different about her, something he recognized as dangerous to the power he'd always exercised. "How dare you speak to me like this?" he said, his voice low and threatening. "After everything I've done for you?" Emily almost laughed at the irony. "Everything you've done for me," she repeated, feeling courage grow inside her like a flame that had been fed by Margaret's words. "You isolated me from my friends. You controlled every penny I earned. You humiliated me in public and in private. You made me believe I was dumb, useless, that I was lucky to have someone like. That's what you did for me, Robert." The words came out like a flood, years of silence finally being broken. Emily was shaking, but not from fear. It was pure adrenaline. It was the feeling of finally speaking truths that had been swallowed for too long. Robert went livid, his mouth opening and closing without being able to form words. He had no answer for that, because deep down, even through all the layers of denial and narcissism, he knew it was true. "You were always weak," Robert finally managed to say, but his voice had lost part of its conviction. It was a desperate attempt to regain control, to use the same tactics that had always worked before. "You always needed someone to take care of you, to make decisions for you. Without me, you're nothing." Emily felt those words try to penetrate, try to plant the doubt they'd always planted before, but this Chimie, they couldn't. This time, there was something stronger inside her. Margaret's words creating a shield. "You're stronger than you think." Emily looked directly into Robert's eyes and said with a calm that surprised both of them, "I survived you for 10 years, Robert. If that's not strength, I don't know what is." The expression on his face was pure shock. No one had ever responded to him like that, especially not Emily, especially not the wife he'd molded to be submissive and controllable. Robert tried a different approach, realizing intimidation wasn't working. His voice became softer, almost Janelle, but Emily recognized the manipulation immediately. "Emily, honey, you're confused. My mother was old. She didn't understand things properly. That will was a mistake. She was being influenced by someone, maybe that lawyer. We can contest this. We can fix everything. We're a couple. We need to stay united." It was the same tactic he always used when intimidation failed, fakey kindness, fake concern, make Emily doubt her own perception. But now, with the clarity Margaret had provided, Emily saw through the manipulation as if it were transparent glass. "No, Robert," she said firmly. "Your mother was perfectly lucid." The lawyer confirmed it. "And we're not really a couple. We never were. We're an abuser and his victim, and I'm not going to accept that role anymore." The mask of kindness instantly fell from Robert's face, replaced by cold and calculated rage. "You're going to regret this," he said, his voice low and loaded with threat. "You think you can defy me? Think anyone's going to believe you? I'm respected in this town, Emily. You're just a quiet little wife nobody pays attention to. If you try to expose me, I'm going to destroy any credibility you think you have." Emily felt fear try to return, that paralyzing fear that had controlled her for so long. But now she had something she didn't have before, proof. Margaret had documented everything, and those documents were in the lawyer's hands. It was no longer just her word against Robert's. "Your mother already exposed you," Emily said calmly. "Everything is documented, dated, detailed. You can't erase that, Robert. The truth is out there now, whether you like it or not." Robert took a threatening step toward Emily, and for a moment she thought he was going to break his pattern of never using physical violence. But he stopped a few inches from her, trembling with rage, hands closed and fists at his sides. "You're going to pay for this," he whispered, and there was so much poison in those words Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. But she didn't lower her gaze, didn't take a step back, didn't show the fear that still existed deep down. Robert realized he'd lost his main weapon. Her submission. Emily was no longer afraid enough to shut up, was no longer so broken she'd accept anything just to keep the peace. Something had fundamentally changed, and Robert knew it. He turned abruptly and left the kitchen, going up the stairs with heavy steps. Emily heard the bedroom door close hard and finally allowed her knees to weaken, sitting in a chair while trembling finally took over her body. She'd done it. Had faced Robert, had spoken truths, had stood firm. It was just the beginning. Emily knew that. The battle was far from over, and Robert wouldn't give up control easily. But something had been awakened inside her, something Margaret had planted and was now starting to grow. It was the perception that she didn't have to live like this anymore, that there was a way out, that she deserved better. Emily took Margaret's letters from her coat pocket and held them against her chest, feeling her mother-in-law's presence there with her, encouraging her, saying she was on the right path. The night would be long, Emily knew. Robert was up there, probably planning his next move, his next attempt to regain control. But Emily was no longer alone in this fight. She had Margaret's words, she had the documented truth, and most importantly, she was starting to have herself back. And that was more powerful than Robert could imagine. The days following that confrontation were the most tense Emily had ever lived. Robert barely spoke to her, but his presence in the house was oppressive, like a storm cloud hovering over everything. He left early for work and came back late, avoiding any direct interaction, but making clear through cold looks and heavy silences that this was far from over. Emily knew he was planning something, scheming some way to regain the control he'd lost. But this Chimmy, she wasn't going to wait passively to see what would happen. For the first time in 10 years, Emily was taking the reins of her own life. In the envelope Margaret had left, besides the letters, there was a business card for a lawyer named Rebecca Morrison, specializing in divorce cases involving emotional abuse. Margaret had left a handwritten, "She'll understand. She help." Emily looked at that card for days, turning it between her fingers, feeling the weight of that decision. Calling that lawyer meant taking the definitive step, meant admitting the marriage was over, that there was no going back. It was terrifying, but it was also liberating. Finally, on a morning when Robert had left early and the house was plunged in an almost peaceful silence, Emily picked up the phone and dialed the number. Her hand shook so much she almost gave up 3 times before the call completed. Rebecca Morrison's office. "Good morning," answered a female, professional voice on the other end. Emily opened her mouth, but no sound came out initially. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Good morning. My name is Emily Hayes. I received Attorney Morrison's contact through Margaret Hayes, who passed away recently. She said that I might need help." There was a pause on the other end, and then the voice became softer, more welcoming. "Emily, Mrs. Hayes contacted us a few months ago. We were waiting for your call. When can you come to the office?" The kindness in that voice almost made Emily break down. Someone was waiting for her. Someone was ready to help. She wasn't alone. The meeting was scheduled for 2 days later, and Emily spent that time in a state of constant anxiety mixed with growing hope. She didn't tell Robert anything. Of course, this had to be done in secret, at least for now. On the scheduled day, Emily told Robert she was going to the library to work some extra hours. A lie he accepted without questioning much, probably relieved to have the house to himself. Emily drove to downtown with her heart beating so hard it felt like it would come out of her chest. Rebecca Morrison's office was in a modern building, very different from Mr. Thompson's old office. The decoration was clean, welcoming, with soft tones that immediately left Emily a bit calmer. When Rebecca came out to receive her in the waiting room, Emily was surprised. She expected someone older, more intimidating, but Rebecca was a woman in her 40s, with short brown hair, colorful framed glasses, and a genuine smile that lit up her face when she saw Emily. "Emily, it's a pleasure to meet you in person," Rebecca said, extending her hand. "Margaret talked a lot about you in our conversations. I'm sorry for your loss." Emily shook the lawyer's hand and felt tears start to form. "Thank you for seeing me," she managed to say. "I don't really know where to start." Rebecca guided her to a comfortable meeting room, with sofas instead of formal chairs, and offered tea or coffee. When both were seated, Rebecca picked up a notepad but kept her posture relaxed and open. "Let's start whatever way is most comfortable for you," she said gently. "There's no rush. I'm here to listen and help with whatever's necessary." And then Emily started talking. She started slowly, stumbling over words, but gradually gained confidence. She told about the years of humiliation, about the financial control, about the isolation, about how she'd felt invisible in her own life. Rebecca listened attentively, taking occasional notes, but mainly just offering her supportive presence. When Emily finished talking, more than an hour had passed. She felt exhausted but also strangely light, as if telling everything to someone who really understood had lifted an enormous weight off her shoulders. Rebecca put the notepad aside and looked at Emily with an expression that mixed compassion and determination. Emily, everything you describe characterizes emotional and psychological abuse. I know it can be difficult to hear this, but it's important to name things for what they are. You were a victim of an abusive relationship, and I want you to know none of this was your fault. Emily nodded, tears flowing freely now. Hearing that from a professional, someone who dealt with these cases regularly, was another layer of validation she didn't even know she needed. Margaret contacted me about 3 months ago, Rebecca continued. She was very worried about you and wanted to ensure you'd have the necessary support when you were ready to take the step of leaving this situation. She gave me copies of the records she kept, and they're extremely detailed and useful for your case. Rebecca explained the rights Emily had, the divorce process, what she could expect. She talked about Margaret's inheritance, which gave Emily financial independence and a safe place to live. Two crucial resources many women in abusive situations don't have. You're in a privileged position in some respects, Rebecca said. You have resources, you have documentation, you have a clear exit, but I know that even so it's scary. Leaving an abusive relationship is never easy, no matter what resources you have. Emily agreed, feeling the truth in those words. Even knowing she had Margaret's house, that she had money, that she had proof. The idea of actually ending the marriage, of officially facing Robert, of rebuilding her life from scratch, was terrifying. I'm so afraid, Emily admitted, her voice breaking. Afraid of what he'll do, afraid of not being able to survive alone, afraid of discovering I'm really as weak as he always said I was. Rebecca leaned forward, her expression intensely sincere. Emily, you survived 10 years of psychological abuse. You maintained your humanity, your ability to care for others, your essence intact despite everything that was done to break you. That's not weakness. That's extraordinary strength. And you won't be alone in this process. I'll be here guiding you through every legal step, and I'm also going to recommend a therapist specializing in trauma from abusive relationships. You'll have a support network Robert never allowed you to have. The lawyer's words echoed Margaret's, and Emily felt something solidify inside her. Maybe she really was stronger than she imagined. Maybe she really could do this. What do I need to do? Emily asked, and there was a new determination in her voice that surprised even herself. Rebecca smiled, recognizing that spark of courage. First, we're going to file for divorce. I'll prepare all the necessary documentation. Second, you need to stop preparing emotionally and practically to leave the house you share with Robert. The next hours were spent discussing practical details. Rebecca explained to Emily had the legal right to remain in the marital home during the process, but suggested that for her emotional safety, it might be better to move to Margaret's house as soon as possible. Abusers typically intensify their behavior when they realize they're losing control, Rebecca warned. Robert has already been publicly exposed by his mother's will. When he receives the divorce papers, the reaction could be intense. You need to have a safety plan. Emily felt fear return, but this time it came accompanied by pragmatism. Rebecca was right. She needed to plan, needed to protect herself, needed to be smart about this. They discussed when would be the best time for Emily to move, what she'd need to take, how to do it safely. Rebecca also gave guidance on how Emily should behave with Robert in the coming weeks before he was officially notified of the divorce. Stay calm, don't confront unnecessarily, document any additional abusive behavior, and above all, keep your plans secret until you're physically out of that house, Rebecca instructed. When Emily left the lawyer's office, it was already late afternoon. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Emily stopped for a moment on the sidewalk just to breathe. She'd done it, had taken the first official step to leave the marriage, to recover her life, to be free. The fear was still there, enormous and scary, but it was no longer the only feeling. There was hope, too, and determination, and a strange but wonderful feeling of finally taking control of her own narrative. Emily looked at Rebecca's business card she still held in her hand and thought of Margaret, of how her mother-in-law had planned all this, had paved each step of the exit path. Thank you, Emily whispered to the sky, as if Margaret could hear her from wherever she was. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I'd given up on myself. The drive home seemed shorter than the one there. Maybe because Emily was so absorbed in her own thoughts, she barely noticed the passage of time. She had 2 weeks to prepare. That was the time Rebecca had suggested before officially filing the divorce papers. 2 weeks to discreetly organize her things, to transfer important documents, to prepare Margaret's house to receive her, to strengthen her resolve. When Emily entered the house, Robert was in the living room watching TV, and he barely looked at her when she passed. "Where were you?" he asked with that tone of disinterest that hid control. "Library, as I said," Emily responded calmly. "Had some projects to organize." Robert just grunted in response, returning his attention to the TV. Emily went up to the bedroom, closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, heart still racing but mind surprisingly clear. The hardest decision of her life had been made, and now it was time to execute the plan, to free herself once and for all, to finally live instead of just survive. The 2 weeks that followed were the most intense and surreal of Emily's life. During the day, she maintained the facade of normalcy, doing her household chores, going to work at the library, minimally interacting with Robert when necessary. But inside, she was meticulously preparing for departure. Little by little, in an extremely discreet way, Emily started transferring her most important things to Margaret's house: personal documents, family photos, some clothes, objects with sentimental value. Everything she could take without Robert noticing was being transported in small portions, hidden in shopping bags or in her work purse. Margaret's house was exactly as her mother-in-law had left it, clean and organized, waiting for Emily like a safe refuge. Each time Emily entered that house, she felt Margaret's comforting presence, as if her mother-in-law was there, saying, "You're doing the right thing. Keep going." Rebecca worked quickly behind the scenes, preparing all the necessary documentation for the divorce petition. She kept Emily informed about each step through careful phone calls, always checking first if Emily was in a safe place to talk. "How are you feeling?" Rebecca would ask at the beginning of each conversation, and Emily appreciated that genuine concern. She was scared, anxious, but also strangely calm, as if she'd finally found a clear purpose after years adrift. Rebecca had also connected Emily with a therapist named Dr. Sarah Chun, specializing in trauma from abusive relationships. The first session had been difficult, even painful, because it meant verbalizing years of pain Emily had tried to bury. But, though Chun was kind and patient, and Emily knew that therapeutic work would be essential for her long-term recovery, it wasn't enough to physically leave the relationship. She needed to heal the emotional wounds Robert had left. The day finally arrived. Emily had arranged with Rebecca that she'd move to Margaret's house on a Saturday. When Robert would be out for a golf tournament, he rarely missed. It was the perfect window of opportunity. Several hours without his supervision. Enough time for Emily to take what she needed and leave. She'd rented a small van, asking for help from an acquaintance from the library who didn't ask many questions. In the morning, Emily prepared breakfast, as always, said goodbye to Robert with a casual wave, and waited for him. As soon as his car disappeared around the corner, Emily started working with an efficiency that surprised her. Years of clothes, books, personal objects, everything was being packed and loaded. She wasn't taking furniture. Those belonged to that life she was leaving behind. She was taking only what was hers, what had personal meaning, what represented who she was before Robert and who she wanted to be after him. When Emily closed the door of that house for the last time, she felt a wave of conflicting emotions: immense relief, sadness for the time lost, fear of the unknown, but above all, a feeling of liberation she hadn't experienced in so long she could barely remember what it was like. She left a letter on the living room table, addressed to Robert. In it, she explained briefly and directly that she was leaving, that the marriage was over, and that he'd be formally notified about the divorce process soon. There were no accusations in the letter, no drama, just facts. Rebecca had helped Emily write it, ensuring it was clear but not provocative. Emily drove to Margaret's house with her hands shaking on the steering wheel. But when she arrived and entered that space that was now hers, she felt a peace descend over her like a protective mantle. She was home, she was safe, she was free. Robert's reaction was explosive, exactly as Rebecca had predicted. He started calling Emily's cell phone incessantly, leaving messages that began with manipulation attempts. "Emily, honey, Let's talk about this. You're confused and quickly escalated to pure rage. You're ungrateful. After everything I did for you, you're going to regret this. Emily, following Rebecca's guidance, didn't answer any calls, but saved all the voicemail messages as evidence. Robert also showed up at Margaret's house a few times, banging on the door, demanding Emily come out to talk. But Emily didn't open, just watched from the window while he eventually gave up and left. Always shouting threats, the neighbors certainly heard. These moments were terrifying, made Emily's heart race and fear return with full force. But she stayed firm, remembering Margaret's words, Rebecca's support, the fact she was no longer alone in this fight. The divorce papers were officially delivered to Robert a week after Emily left. Rebecca had opted for formal notification through a process server, ensuring everything was properly documented. His reaction, according to what the server reported to Rebecca, was one of shock and intense rage. But now, it was official, it was registered, there was no going back. The legal process had begun. And then, something unexpected started happening. Robert's behavior started coming to light in town in a way Emily hadn't anticipated. Margaret's will, with its detailed records, wasn't exactly secret. Mr. Thompson, following Margaret's instructions, had shared relevant copies with some local authorities, including the Human Resources Department of the bank where Robert worked. Conversations started emerging. Whispers initially, then more open discussions. People who had interacted with Robert over the years started recognizing patterns they'd previously ignored or excused. A co-worker of Robert's, a woman named Jennifer who worked in the loans department, finally had the courage to make a formal complaint about his behavior. She described years of condescending comments, of Robert undermining her contributions and meetings, of him appropriating her ideas and presenting them as his own. Other people from the bank started speaking up too, each adding their piece to the puzzle of what Robert really was behind the professional facade. The bank initiated an internal investigation, and Robert was placed on administrative leave while the allegations. The news spread through the small town of Briarwood like wildfire in dry grass. Suddenly, the man everyone thought was so respectable was being questioned, was being seen under a completely different light. Emily heard about it through acquaintance. Through conversation, she called at the library and felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because the truth was finally being recognized. Sadness because so many people had suffered at Robert's hands over the years. Emily started receiving messages of support from people she didn't even imagine cared. Old friends she'd lost contact with during the marriage reached out, offering support and apologizing for not having noticed what was happening. Neighbors who had witnessed some of Robert's episodes shouting at Margaret's house came forward as potential witnesses if necessary. The head librarian, Mrs. Patterson, a 70-year-old lady who had always been kind to Emily, called her in for a conversation and said, "Emily, dear, I always knew something was wrong. I saw how you changed over the years, how you kept fading. I'm sorry for not asking, for not helping, but I'm here now, if you need anything." Emily cried, hearing that, not from sadness but from gratitude. She was no longer alone, was no longer being seen as the quiet little wife nobody paid attention to. She was being seen as a survivor, as someone brave enough to leave a horrible situation. Rebecca suggested Emily participate in a support group for women in abusive relationships. Initially, Emily was hesitant, ashamed to expose her story to strangers. But when she finally gathered courage to go to the first meeting, she discovered something transformative. There were other women there, of all ages and backgrounds, each with their own emotional story of survival and recovery. Some were still in the early stages of recognizing abuse, others were years out of toxic relationships and offered hope through their examples of reconstruction. Emily heard stories that echoed her own experience so much that sometimes she had to hold back tears. She heard about financial control, social isolation, emotional manipulation, about how these women had also been made to believe they were crazy, too sensitive, ungrateful, and she also heard about strength, about new beginnings, about how it was possible not just to survive but to thrive after leaving. Emily started sharing her own story in that safe space, and with each meeting felt a bit lighter, a bit more healed. Months were passing, and Emily's life was gradually taking on a new shape. The divorce process moved forward, with Robert trying to make it difficult at every possible step, but Rebecca was competent and relentless in Emily's defense. Margaret's house had truly become Emily's home. each room being slowly transformed to reflect who she really was, without the restrictions Robert had imposed. Emily had started working full-time at the library, and Mrs. Patterson had even suggested she consider formally studying library science, something Emmeline had never allowed herself to dream before. The therapy sessions with Dr. Chun continued, and Emily was learning to rebuild herself, to recognize toxic patterns, to establish healthy boundaries. It was hard work, painful sometimes, but necessary. Emily was deconstructing years of abusive conditioning and rebuilding a version of herself that was authentic, strong, free. In town, Robert's reputation had been severely damaged. The bank eventually fired him after the internal investigation confirmed multiple instances of inappropriate and abusive behavior. He had to sell the marital home as part of the divorce settlement, and Emily heard through acquaintances that he'd moved to another town, trying to start over where no one knew his story. Emily didn't feel pleasure in his downfall. It wasn't revenge she was seeking, but there was a sense of justice being done, even if Margaret was no longer alive to see it, but her voice had finally been heard. Her records had served the purpose she intended, to protect Emily and expose the truth about the son she loved but could no longer ignore. It was a sad story in many ways, a broken family, destroyed relationships, lost years, but it was also a story of hope, of new beginnings, of a woman finding her strength when she least expected it. And Emily understood now that her story didn't end with escaping the abusive relationship, but with the courageous reconstruction of a life worth living. Emily Hayes had freed herself, and that freedom was the most precious inheritance Margaret could have left her. 6 months after leaving the house, she shared with Robert. Emily woke up on a spring morning with sun coming through the windows of the bedroom that was now truly hers. It was one of the bedrooms in Margaret's house, which Emily had completely redecorated, painting the walls a soft blue she'd always loved but had never been allowed to use. The bed was new, bought with her own money, as were the light curtains that danced with the breeze coming through the open window. Emily stretched, feeling at peace. She barely remembered what it was like. There wasn't that constant tension in her stomach, that fear of doing something wrong, that need to walk on emotional eggshells. There was just tranquility and genuine excitement for another day that was hers, completely hers. Emily smiled to herself, thinking how she would have found it impossible to reach this point just a few months ago. But here she was, not just surviving, but truly beginning to thrive. The divorce had been finalized just 3 weeks ago. It had been a long and draining process, with Robert trying to contest almost everything, using every delay and manipulation tactic he could. But Rebecca had been relentless, using Margaret's records and the accumulated evidence to ensure Emily left the marriage with what was rightfully hers. Emily had kept Margaret's house, half of her mother-in-law's savings as per the will, and a small pension from the assets she and Robert had built together during the marriage. It wasn't a fortune, but it was independent. It was security. It was freedom. When the judge banged the gavel and declared the divorce finalized, Emily felt as if a 1,000-pound weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She was officially free, legally separated from the man who had tried to destroy her for so many years. And Robert? He'd left the courthouse with his face red with rage, but Emily hadn't even looked at him. That chapter was closed, and she had no interest in revisiting it. Emily had started working full-time at the library, and Mrs. Patterson had become not just a boss, but a mentor and friend. The librarian had been impressed with Emily's dedication and knowledge and had encouraged her to enroll in an online library science program offered by a state university. Emily had been terrified at the idea, initially. Robert had always said she wasn't smart enough for those things, that it would be a waste of time and money. But Dr. Chun had worked with Emily on these automatic negative thoughts, helping her recognize they were echoes of Robert's voice, not truths about who she really was. So Emily had gathered courage and applied, and to her surprise, she'd been accepted. Now, besides work at the library, she spent a few hours a week studying, reading academic texts, participating in online forums. And you know what she discovered? She was intelligent. She was capable. She loved learning. Robert had lied about so many things, and this was just one more. The friendships Emily had lost during the marriage were gradually being rebuilt. Some were irretrievable relationships that had died completely during the years of isolation. But others, the true ones, had resurged as soon as Emily had taken the first step to reconnect. Her college friend, Lisa, with whom she'd lost contact more than 5 years ago, had come back into her life with full force. They met for coffee every week, talked about everything and nothing, laughed in a way Emily had forgotten was possible. Lisa never made Emily feel guilty about the years of silence, just said she was happy to have her back. Emily had also made new friendships through the support group, deep connections formed through shared experiences of survival and recovery. These women understood her journey in a way few could, and the mutual support was invaluable. Emily was no longer alone, was no longer isolated. She had a network of people who genuinely cared about her, and that made all the difference. Therapy with Dr. Chun continued being an essential part of Emily's life. They worked not just on the trauma from the relationship with Robert, but also on deeper issues of self-esteem and identity. Emily was learning to recognize her own desires and needs, something that had been completely suppressed for years. She was learning to say no without guilt, to establish healthy boundaries, to trust her own perception of reality. There were difficult days, of course. Days when the old thought patterns tried to return, when Emily found herself doubting herself or feeling she didn't deserve the happiness she was building. But Dr. Chun helped to navigate these moments, reminding her of how much progress she'd made, how far she'd come. Recovery isn't linear, Dr. Chun said frequently. You're going to have ups and downs, and that's completely normal. What matters is that you keep moving forward, even if it's just one tiny step at a time. Emily had started honoring Margaret in small but significant ways. She maintained the house's garden with the same care her mother-in-law had, planting new flowers each season. She'd framed a photo of Margaret and placed it in the living room, along with one of the letters she'd left, the one that said, "You're stronger than you think." Sometimes, when she was having a particularly difficult day, Emily would sit in that living room and talk to Margaret's photo, telling about her victories and challenges, thanking her for everything her mother-in-law had done. It was a way to keep alive the memory of that extraordinary woman who had saved Emily even after her own death. Emily had also started contributing financially to the support group she attended, using part of Margaret's inheritance to help other women who were trying to leave abusive relationships but didn't have resources. It was a way to pay forward the help she'd received, to honor Margaret through actions that helped other people in the same situation Emily had been in. Emily's relationship with her own reflection had changed dramatically. Before, she avoided mirrors, hated what she saw when she looked at herself. Now, when she passed by a mirror, she recognized the woman looking back. There was life in her eyes again. There was color in her cheeks. There was a genuine smile that appeared with increasing frequency. Emily had started taking care of herself in ways she'd never done before. Not because someone was judging her appearance, but because she deserved to feel good about herself. She bought clothes she liked, not that Robert would approve. She wore her hair the way she found beautiful, not the way he said looked best. She went to the gym, not to lose weight because Robert had commented about her extra pounds, but because she liked how she felt after exercising. Each small choice Emily made for herself, based on her own desires and not someone else's expectations, was an act of liberation, a declaration of independence. Emily had also started dreaming again, something she'd stopped doing so long ago she didn't even remember when. She thought about maybe traveling someday, visiting places she'd read about in books, but had never had the courage to suggest to Robert. She thought about maybe adopting a dog or cat, animal companionship she'd always wanted but Robert said was unnecessary mess. She thought about the possibility of, eventually, when she was healed enough, opening herself to a healthy relationship in the future, although that idea was still scary. But most importantly, Emily thought about herself as someone with a future, with possibilities, with potential. During years with Robert, she'd felt stagnant, trapped, as if her life had paused on the wedding day and would never resume. Now, she saw a path opening ahead of her, full of options and opportunities that were hers to choose. It was exciting and terrifying at the same time, but mainly it was liberating. In the support group, Emily had started sharing her story more openly and realized she was helping other women who were in the early stages of recognizing their own abuse. She saw in these women the reflection of who she'd been, saw the fear in their eyes, the doubt, the guilt, all the feelings Emily knew so well. And when she told her story, when she shared about how she'd managed to leave and start rebuilding, she saw hope light up in their eyes. It was powerful to realize that her journey, as painful as it had been, could serve as inspiration and encouragement for other people. One of the women in the group, a young girl named Amy, who was in a relationship very similar to what Emily had lived through, had approached her after a meeting. "Hearing you makes me believe I can do it too," Amy had said, tears streaming down her face. Emily had hugged her and whispered, "You can. You're stronger than you think." The same words Margaret had said to her, now being passed forward. On a particularly beautiful Saturday afternoon, Emily was in the garden planting roses, the same ones Margaret used to have, when she stopped for a moment to appreciate everything around her. The sky was blue and clear. Birds sang in the trees. There was a gentle breeze carrying the smell of freshly planted flowers, and Emily realized with crystal clarity that she was happy. Not the performative happiness she'd faked for years to keep up appearances, but genuine happiness, the kind that comes from within, that doesn't depend on anyone else. She was at peace with herself, was building a life that had meaning and purpose, was surrounded by people who truly loved and respected. The path to get there had been long and painful, marked by total humiliation and years of silent suffering. But she had survived. More than that, she had freed herself. And now she was living, truly living, in a way she'd never imagined was possible. Emily went inside, washed her hands dirty with soil, and picked up one of Margaret's letters she kept in the kitchen drawer. It was the one she read whenever she needed a reminder of where she'd come from and where she was going. The most valuable inheritance wasn't the money, Margaret had written, but the truth that freed you. Use that freedom wisely, Emily. Live the life you deserve, not the life someone tried to force on you. Be happy, be free, be yourself. That's my last wish for you. Emily held the letter against her chest, feeling tears of gratitude stream down her face. Margaret was no longer alive, but her legacy lived through Emily, through the freedom she'd conquered, through the life she was building. Emily was no longer submissive, was no longer invisible, was no longer the fated woman Robert had tried to create. She was an example of survival, of courage, of new beginnings. She was a woman who had learned the hardest way that you can lose yourself in a toxic relationship, but that you can also find yourself again when you finally find the strength to leave. Emily Hayes had freed herself, and that freedom was the most precious inheritance Margaret could have left her. Emily's story shows us that freedom sometimes arrives through the most unexpected paths. Margaret couldn't save her daughter-in-law while alive, but her posthumous courage gave Emily something no one else had given: the validation that her pain was real and the tools to rebuild her life. Sometimes, the greatest inheritance isn't money or a property, but the truth that frees us from the invisible chains we carry. And have you been through something similar? Do you know someone living in a similar situation who can't see the way out? What would you do if you were in Emily's place? Or if you were Margaret, having to watch someone you love suffer at the hands of your own son? Leave your opinion in the comment. Your experiences can help other people going through difficult situations. If this emotional story with a happy ending touched your heart, if you felt Emily's pain and celebrated her liberation, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss other emotional stories that bring life lessons and make us reflect on our own choices and relations. Real stories like this remind us it's never too late to start over, that there's life after abuse, and that sometimes the person who saves us can come from where we least expect. See you in the next story.